Hey everyone! Before we jump into everything you need to know about how test optional policies will impact you this year, we first wanted to let you know that with your free CollegeVine account, you can find out your chances based on if you're applying test optional or not using our chancing engine. From there, you can use our hub tool to build your school list and see information about each school, such as your chances, costs and scholarships, majors, and more. Visit the link in the description below to sign up and see your chances today.
So obviously, I know a lot of you are very concerned about the test optional admissions policies that have been rolling out around the country. Before we get into that, I do want to just quickly introduce myself. My name is Vinay Bhaskara. I am one of the co-founders of CollegeVine, and I'm also our head of admissions advising and data. And so the reason we're having this presentation today is we recently took a look at some of the data that we have from all the students in our system, as well as some of the data that's out there available more broadly. And then we also talked to a few admissions officers to put together some guidelines and some thoughts on how you should think about test optional admissions policies, right? I'm sure many of you are very, very stressed about this. We've talked to a lot of families, obviously, and even school guidance counselors, and everyone pretty much agrees that the test optional policies are really, really worrisome for a lot of folks. So I'm gonna kind of start by walking through just what the data says about test optional policies and what our overall advice is as CollegeVine. So I think with that, let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing to understand, obviously, is that there are more than 400 colleges who have announced test optional admissions policies for this upcoming admission cycle. And by the way, there's a handout that's going to be on the screen right here. It's a post that I wrote up for the community over on Reddit, just to kind of share this information with as many students as possible. And so we're going to be just referencing this as we go through today's presentation. So more than 400 colleges have announced test optional policies for 1 year only during this fall, as a result of obviously the testing disruptions from the COVID-19 pandemic. And these test optional policies are usually referring to the SAT or the ACT. Basically, you don't have to take an SAT or an ACT to be able to qualify for these schools. In normal years, these 400 or so schools would have test required policies, which means that you are required to sort of complete the SAT or the ACT in order to gain admission to the university, right? So, this is a difference, obviously, in their approach, right? Now, in addition to these 400 schools, there's also close to 800 schools that already had test optional admissions policies, right? So the strategy here is both for the schools that are test optional for the first time this year, and also for the schools that have historically had the test optional policies, okay? Right. And now, as I wrote here in this post, I do want to give a disclaimer, which is that obviously what I'm sharing with you right now is my current point of view based on the best information available to me at this moment. Right. So my advice or my strategy or my perspective is going to change if things continue to change with testing in the rest of this fall as the pandemic continues in America. Right. So obviously, you just want to take it with a grain of salt that this may change and my advice may change over time. But as of right now, here's kind of the best advice that I have for all of you out there. Okay. So let's start with a very high level strategy. So if you are really rushed for time or you need to go grab dinner or whatever, if you just pay attention to these next 2 minutes or this next minute and a half, you're going to be good to go as far as just knowing the basic strategy. And then you can always follow up by checking out this Reddit post down the line. But basically, here is the very high-level advice that I have for all of you out there in terms of test optional strategy. Basically, look up. So the way you want to think about this is you want to choose whether or not to submit your test scores to a school using some of the data that exists from that college. And in particular, what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to look up the 25th to 75th percentile SAT and ACT scores for accepted students, right? These are what the historical averages are for students that get accepted. So, for example, a school might have a 25th to 75th percentile ACT range of a 31 to a 35. That means that of say 100 students that get accepted, 75 of them have a score above a 31, and 25 of them have a score of 35 or higher, right? So the middle 50%, okay? Now, these are the the scores rather, that students use to apply successfully in the past. But this year with the pandemic, test scores in the applicant pool are actually a little bit lower. So our advice for this year is, if you have an SAT score and you're applying to a test optional school, and that SAT score is within 60 points of that 25th percentile score. So say, for example, that the middle 50 range is a 1250 to a 1400, right? If your score is an 1190 or higher, my recommendation is that you actually submit that test score, because the scores are lower this year than normal, you're going to benefit from submitting that test score. Similarly, if you have an ACT score, right, you're going to want to submit it as long as you're within 3 points of that 25th percentile score, right? So say, for example, the 25th to 75th percentile is a 28 to a 32. As long as your score is a 25 or higher, submit the score and you'll get a benefit from it, right? Now, if you don't meet this minimum standard, so within 60 points of the 25th percentile for SAT, within 3 points of the 25th percentile for ACT, if you don't meet those minimum requirements, my recommendation is to apply test optional, right? So when a school has a test optional policy, right, you want to apply with a test score if you have it, unless you are below those numbers that I just discussed. Now, obviously, if you don't have an SAT or ACT score and you won't have an opportunity to take one before you apply this fall, then you're going to have to apply test optional. And we'll talk about the best ways to do that a little bit down the line. But just, if you do have a test, you may still want to consider applying test optional in certain circumstances that I just laid out. Okay. So that's my basic advice. If you want to leave right now and just bank on that advice and that strategy, that's totally fine. And I'm actually going to drop all of you a link to this post right here that I'm referring to if you want to read along and follow along with me. Right, this is a post that I wrote up on Reddit to kind of share our perspective and our strategy with the broader community of students that are applying to college. So let's keep going here, right? So we talked a little bit about just sort of the general notion of the, when you should be submitting a standardized test. Now let's actually take a step back and understand why colleges have created these test optional policies in the first place, right? So obviously in the middle of the pandemic, because of the pandemic, many colleges have switched to these test optional policies, right? Because of testing disruptions due to the virus, right? But even, prior to the pandemic, like I said, close to a third of all the undergraduate colleges in the US had test optional policies already. And this included a few selective colleges like UChicago or Bowdoin, right? And so in general, colleges have two main goals that they are trying to achieve with test optional policies, right? Goal number one is they're trying to increase the number of people that apply to the college, right? So at selective colleges, what this will do is it allows them to bring their acceptance rate down, right? So if you get more applications from students who you're going to reject anyway, you bring your acceptance rate down, which makes students think that you're more prestigious, right? It's kind of a little bit tricky, honestly, right? At non-selective colleges, right, colleges that have an acceptance rate above, 35, 40%, even at those schools, right, they're just trying to increase the number of kids that are enrolled in their school, right? They're genuinely trying to increase their enrollment, and they're genuinely trying to be more accessible to students, right? So, the increase in application volume is kind of the number one reason that colleges implement test optional policies, but they're using it for different reasons. And there's still a gap between, allowing you to apply to the school via test optional and who actually gets accepted, right? Okay. The second goal that colleges have with test optional policies is they offer a way for colleges to bring in students that have other sort of profile traits that they want, that they consider desirable. So stuff like, being from a certain geographic area or being from a demographic group that the college wants to increase on its campus, right? What test optional policies allow you to do is they allow you to accept more students from those, that have those traits who have lower test scores, right? And what this does is it protects that statistic that we talked about earlier, the middle 50% test score statistic, right? And so colleges actually care a lot about that middle 50% test score statistic. And the reason they care a lot about it is it's used in rankings like the US News rankings, right? So the test scores of the student body affect the college's prestige and ranking. So a lot of test optional policies are in part a way for the college to kind of like manage that ranking and make sure that they do well in the US News rankings, even as they're accepting students that have other traits that they're kind of going for, right? Whether that's student athletes or legacy students or so on, right? So test optional policies are, not only are they a way to increase application volume, they're also a way for colleges to kind of massage and not lie, but massage and sort of play around with their test score statistics, right? Finally, colleges actually get a ton of positive PR for having test optional policies on paper, right? I'm sure you've seen many of those news articles during this previous application cycle. But despite the positive PR that colleges are receiving, oftentimes they don't actually run a truly test optional admissions process, which is to say that they allow you to apply without a test, but they still overwhelmingly accept students that have a test. So let's actually take a look at what that data is like. Random sample of 25,000 students in our, CollegeVine's, platform that use CollegeVine's platform, and analyze their admissions results after they apply test optional. And what I did to make sure this was a sort of fair test is I looked at students from the same kind of geographic backgrounds, so from the same part of the country, and the same, demographic background, which is to say the same sort of socioeconomic status and so on, as well as race and gender and etc. And then I also looked at students who had similar non-test profiles. So other than the test, I looked for kids that had similar GPAs, similar extracurricular profiles in terms of like strength and area of focus, similar course profiles in terms of the level of difficulty of courses that they took. So I held all of that constant, and then I broke students into 3 different categories and looked at the differences in acceptance rate. So basically, for students where everything else was pretty much the same, right? I looked at students that applied with a test score that was above the 25th percentile for an accepted student, students where they applied with a test score that was below that 25th percentile, and students that applied test optional, right? And so as you'd expect, right, students that had a test score above the 25th percentile really outperformed the test optional kids historically, right? The acceptance rate was about twice as high. So if out of, say 50 students who applied, test optional to a school, say that 10 of them, if 50 applied test optional and 50 applied with a above the 25th percentile, and 10 of the test optional kids got in, usually on average about have gotten in, right? Your chances of admission would have roughly doubled if you had a test score above the 25th percentile versus if you applied test optional. So that's a pretty expected result, right? You'd expect, that someone who has a really good test score plus a great application versus someone who has a great application and no test score, the great application plus test score is going to do better. But the really interesting result that we found is that even, if you applied with a test score below the 25th percentile, right? Even if you applied with a test score that was below that 25th percentile, you still actually had a higher chance of admission, right? So if, say, 10% of the kids that applied test optional got in, 12.5%, or about 1.2 times, the kids with a test score below the 25th percentile still got in. So applying with a bad test score, maybe not a horrible test score, but a bad test score, was actually still going to give you a higher acceptance rate than applying with no test score, right? So historically, right, colleges have really not been truly test optional, right? The minute you apply without a test score, you're put at a severe disadvantage. The other thing I looked at was kind of the more broad data. Beyond these 25,000 profiles, what does it look like across all colleges? And so, according to the broader data, right, at test optional schools that are selective, which means that they have a below 33% chance of admission, below 33% acceptance rate, right? Something like 94% of the kids that got accepted to those test optional schools had an SAT or an ACT, right? Across all of the 750 schools that had test optional policies prior to 2020, about 83% of the accepted students got, had an SAT or an ACT score. And even at schools with a acceptance rate higher than 80%, still like 66% of kids were applying and submitting an SAT or an ACT score, right? So the historical data suggests that you're going to overwhelmingly suggest rather, that you're going to benefit from applying with a test score, right? So that's kind of what the historical data says, and the data in CollegeVine system says, right? Now, another thing to kind of keep in mind. So this is what the historical data says, and so in general, our recommendation is to try and apply with a test if you can, whether that's because you already have one or if you plan to take an exam during this fall. And hopefully something that will make all of you feel a little bit better is the fact that actually, as I mentioned earlier, test scores have come down a bit in the student population, right? And what I mean by that is that, this cycle, as opposed to previous cycles, the average SAT score of someone applying to any school is actually lower, right? And so, how much lower and kind of what does that look like? I'll talk about how we determine that, right? Basically, to get a sense of what's going on, I took a look at the class of 2020 versus the class of 2021. And I compared the test scores that each group had at this point in the admission cycle, right? So to get a sense of how much higher were class of 2020 SAT scores than class of 2021. And the reason you'd expect class of 2020 SAT scores to be higher is that class of 2020 at this point had multiple chances to take super scored, to take the SAT or ACT and get a super score, or a highest score in each section combined that was higher, right? Whereas in the class of 2021, even if you're lucky enough to have a test, usually it's only going to be, one test that you're working with, right? So, that's kind of the expectation going in. And I went in and kind of looked at the data. And what I did to make sure it was kind of clean is I made sure that we looked at students based on their GPA. So I kind of clustered based on the GPA to make sure that, we're looking at students that have a similar academic background. I also, looked at students within a particular geography, right, to control for the impact of the pandemic, because obviously different parts of the country have had different impacts due to COVID-19, right? And so when I did this, and I looked at this analysis, right, and you basically look at students who come from a kind of similar GPA and geography, right, test scores are actually lower, especially when you look at super scores, right? Because for most people, it's their first sitting on the SAT that they'll be submitting, as opposed to, the combination of their first, second, and third sittings, right? And so in general, super scored SATs were about 60 points lower, which is to say that if for a given GPA and geography, say, 3.5 to 3.6 GPA in Texas, right? If last year those students had an average SAT of 1350, this year those same students have an average SAT of like 1290, right? About 60 points lower. Math scores were 26 points lower and reading scores were 34 points lower. So you saw a bigger impact on the reading side than on the math side. On the ACT, super scored ACTs were about 3 points lower in terms of score, right? And on specific sections, math was 0.4 points lower, reading was 1.1 points lower, science was 0.9 points lower, and English was 0.6 points lower. So, in other words, SAT and ACT scores are lower than they usually are amongst all of the applicants that are applying to college alongside all of you, right? So this means that at schools that are going to use that super score, where they take your best section, your best score on each section, regardless of which test date you took it on, right? You can actually safely submit a test even if your scores are a little bit lower than the historical averages for accepted students, like we talked about earlier. So if you're, within 60 points or within 3 points of that 25th percentile, you should strongly consider applying test optional, right? So that's kind of the sort of backdrop, right? And now I want to kind of move on to the notion of whether you should plan on taking or retaking the SAT this fall, right? So, we'll start by talking about a little bit about kind of test optional policies and who benefits and who doesn't, right? And so, independent of kind of what the overall population is saying and what college is saying, right, you want to keep in mind that different students are going to be treated differently when they apply test optional, right? This obviously seems pretty obvious, right? But if the rest of your profile is just awesome, right? You've got amazing extracurricular activities, you write these incredible, compelling, powerful essays, you've got a really, really high GPA, and you've taken a bunch of AP classes, you're probably going to be better off applying test optional than if you, rush your essays and only get them done at the last minute, and you have, a lower GPA than a lot of the other kids applying to that school, and you have a sort of weaker extracurricular profile than a lot of your classmates, right? Obviously, the student who's got a much stronger non-test profile is going to be better off when applying test optional, right? But even beyond that, as we talked about earlier, a lot of colleges use test optional policies as a way to bring students who maybe have lower test scores but have other kind of desirable traits, right? And so, from that perspective, right, if you have a hook or a specific profile trait that colleges really sort of want to recruit more of, right, you're going to be better positioned to benefit from these test optional policies, right? And so what are some of those desirable profile traits and hooks, right? The first, obviously, is if you're from a demographic background that a college is trying to recruit, right? At a lot of selective schools, this is sort of, underrepresented minority students, but, it really varies, right? There are some schools, a lot of liberal arts colleges, for example, really are trying to recruit more Asian American students, right? So it really just depends kind of on, the school that you're looking at. But in general, if you're from a demographic group that the college is trying to recruit, you can benefit from test optional policies. Another sort of, desirable sort of trait is if you're first generation, right? If you're the first person in your family to attend a four-year college. Now, I get a lot of questions about this from families that have sort of recently immigrant, where, maybe the parent is a recent immigrant, right? First generation to colleges means that you are the first person in your generation to go to college, period. Not just that you are the first person to go to college in the United States. So, for example, if your parents went to four-year undergrad, or have a master's degree or whatever from Brazil or from China or from El Salvador or from wherever, you don't really count as first gen in the same way for colleges. Whereas if you sort of, whereas if your family has never, no one in your family has ever gone to college, then that's where you're going to be, that's where you're going to sort of be a first gen student, considered a first gen student by universities, right? And the last sort of cohort is if you just have some sort of interesting story in your admissions process. So basically, if you are in your life, not in your admissions process, but you have an interesting life story. So, for example, if you're a single parent, if you come from a single parent household, or you spent a lot of time, living in a particular part of the world, and so on and so forth, right? Basically, just some sort of interesting life experience is also a factor when it comes to whether you'll benefit from test optional policies. The converse of this is that if you're just a typical sort of, middle class, upper middle class applicant from a suburban high school, right, you're going to be less well positioned to benefit from these test optional policies, right? If you're just sort of a prototypical kind of high school student, you've had a couple of chances to take the SAT, whether it's, in your junior fall or your senior spring, right, you're going to be much less well positioned, particularly at those selective colleges that we've talked about before, right? So in general, right, if you are kind of just a typical student without one of those hooks that I talked about, the tests are a lot more critical for you than they are for someone else, right? And so as we talked about earlier, if you're applying test optional, you ideally want to have a sort of non-test profile that's very, very strong. What does that mean, right? You're going to be better positioned to apply test optional if you have a GPA that's really high, above the 70th percentile, for example. You're going to be really well positioned if you have a strong extracurricular profile, and and so on, right? Now, a lot of that's going to be out of your control, but the one thing that you are going to be able to do this year really, really well is aim for basically aim for really, really strong essays. If you write just completely awesome, unbelievable, amazing essays, that's going to position you really, really, really well when you're applying test optional. It's going to be actually mission critical when you're applying test optional to have really awesome essays. So with all of this in mind, should you end up retaking the SAT or the ACT this fall? Like, is that something that you should plan on doing this fall? Honestly, the answer depends, right? Obviously, at a very high level, right? Do what makes you safe, right? So if you're in a situation where someone in your household is immunocompromised or old or at some sort of risk for the coronavirus, right? And your town or your community also has had many outbreaks or so on, or is in the midst of an outbreak, right? I would say maybe be careful at that point, right? It's not worth your family's health. And obviously, we'll talk about how you can communicate to colleges about this decision that you made, right? Which is, hey, I have someone who's immunocompromised in my household, and so I chose not to, do that, right? But if it is generally safe to do so, right, I would recommend taking the SAT or the ACT this fall, right? Because taking the test gives you an option, right? If you take the test, you don't do well, you can always apply test optional. But if you don't take the test, you might miss out on a potential boost to your application, right? So, obviously with the caveat that you want to be safe and you want to make sure that taking the test is safe for both you and your loved ones. With that caveat in mind, my recommendation is to try and take or retake the test if it is not canceled in your in your community or in your school district or wherever. Okay, So that's sort of my general advice on retaking the SAT or the ACT as well. I'm going to quickly grab a drink of water, and then we'll move on to talking about this in your application and how to communicate about this in your application. And as I'm grabbing this drink of water, I'm just going to resend out the, I'm going to be resending out the link to this Reddit post that I've been, using to communicate and kind of share all of our information about test optional policies. So yeah, you should see that link to the Reddit post pop up on your screen very shortly. Okay, great. Okay, so now let's say that for whatever reason you're choosing to apply test optional. Maybe it's because obviously you've had a lot of disruptions to test optional in your community, right? Okay, so you've had a lot of challenges test optional wise, and so you haven't been able to take the test in your community. Okay, if that is the case, it is very, very important that you communicate this to colleges and you communicate the reasons why. Whether those reasons are testing was canceled in my community, or the reason was, hey, I didn't feel safe because I live with my grandparents, I live with my parents, I live with whomever, and I wasn't able to take the test safely. Regardless of what the reasons are, you want to make sure that you communicate to colleges, sort of why and how you've gone to test optional policies. Or sorry, why and how you're applying test optional and like kind of the rationale for that. And so there's 2 steps that you need to take in order to communicate this to colleges. Step number 1 is you need to share a brief chronology of the tests that you were, planning on taking and kind of why you didn't end up taking them, whether they were canceled or you chose not to for health reasons, right? And you need to share this information on your application to colleges, right? Now, on the Common App, what you're going to do is you're going to use the additional information section, and I'll walk you all through how you can do that in a bit. Whereas on other sort of applications, right, you're gonna have to figure out what the box is. If there is no box for sharing additional information or context, you want to make sure you email the admissions officers at the school, ideally whoever is the admissions officer responsible for your region of the country, right? That's who you want to reach out to via email or via some sort of communication. You want to reach out to them about this question and about and share the context for why you're applying this option. Okay. Right. And it's very critical that you do this in response to the additional information section, not in response to the COVID prompt. A lot of people make the mistake of writing about this in response to the COVID prompt. And the reason you don't want to do that is the COVID prompt is really supposed to be about kind of impacts to you and your family's, health or economics or, mental health, right? It's really meant to be about kind of material negative impacts, not impacts to your education or to your, impacts to your education or to your extracurricular activities, right? It's really the COVID prompt is really supposed to be about these big material impacts. The sort of additional information sections where you can share details about lost opportunities and so on. So that's sort of the importance of, that's kind of the first piece in terms of your outbound communication. The second piece in terms of communication is you want to make sure that your school counselor or your guidance counselor also writes about this in their recommendation letter. So you want your school counselor or your guidance counselor to say, hey, student so-and-so was not able to take an SAT or an ACT because of cancellations or because of health reasons in our, part of the country. So please keep that in mind. If they sort of write that into their letter of recommendation, that's going to help kind of validate your decision not to apply or sort of to apply test optional, right? Oops, sorry about that. I'm just trying to get rid of this ad here. Okay, finally, the last piece is, what about SATs and AP exams? SAT 2s and AP exams, sorry, right? So SAT 2s and AP exams are not really going to matter for this upcoming admission cycle. And actually kind of out of their, on their way out in the admissions process anyway, right? There's really only 30 schools or so where the SAT 2 still matters. And in normal years of those schools, SAT 2s are actually more of what you'd call an ante, where good scores are necessary but not sufficient than a competitive advantage, right? But the honest truth is that most of the colleges that use SAT2s in a normal cycle are actually SAT2 blind this year, which means they're not even going to look at your SAT2s. So honestly, I would recommend just not even taking SAT2s or retaking them this fall. There's just not any value to you. You're better off either taking or retaking SAT or just, spending your time on something else, right? AP exams, meanwhile, have just actually really not ever mattered all that much in the admissions process in the first place, right? AP classes actually matter a lot because AP classes are sort of, how colleges determine your academic ability level. But AP exams really have never mattered too much to colleges, right? And the only case in which they're important is if your high school has like a super atypical grading system where it's hard for colleges to get a sense of your ability level. But absent that, AP exams are really not that useful in a normal cycle, and they're going to be particularly useless during this application cycle because of sort of the online AP exams and all the problems that they had this past May. So yeah, in general, I wouldn't worry about SAT2s and AP exams.
Thank you, everyone, and stay tuned for future live streams from CollegeVine.